Today we're going to talk about the art of the ancient Etruscans and the Romans, and we're going to look all the way from the Iron Age into the Etruscan civilizations, and then a little bit about the Roman monarchy, and right into the Roman Empire. So first, we want to start off with the Roman Neolithic villages, which were from about 1300 before Christ to about 950 before Christ. That would have been the Iron Age. The hut lies on the fringe of the Iron Age settlement of Fidene and measures approximately 5 by 6 meters. It has a small portico or porch and walls which collapsed in a fire of great intensity. A man-made bank of tuffs run along the outside of the buildings on two sides. The portico protected the entrance on the western side of the building and consisted of two parallel walls. The hut walls were made with wooden planks in between which loam is pressed. Vertical posts at regular intervals along the outside of the wall impart rigidity to the hut walls. Traces of the roof consist of burnt beams on the floor. The roof was probably thatched with a frame of beams covering with branches and with straw. It was supported by 4 posts, which were set within the building. In the area around the building, there were also rows of posts which probably functioned as supports for the eaves. Inside the hut, at least 4 storage jars were recovered, as well as some truncated pyramids, which must have functioned as fire dogs of some kind, since they were found around the central hearth. It is likely that a sudden fire destroyed the building while it was fully in use. A domestic cat was trapped inside the building by the fire and subsequent collapse. Its skeletal remains were excavated in the southeastern corner of the hut. Other faunal remains document the keeping of sheep and goats, cattle and pigs. There is hardly any evidence for game consumption. Botanical evidence indicates that the cultivation of vegetables and cereals such as barley and wheat, which were consumed. So very, kind of good idea through this archaeological excavation of what life might have been like for these early Iron Age peoples in ancient Rome. So believed to be the work of Etruscan artists, Romulus and Remus were credited as the ancient ancestors of Rome. The story tells us they were abandoned by the Tigris River by a wicked uncle, and they were left there to die. They lived because they were nurtured by a she-wolf. The twins were then raised by a shepherd, and when they grew up and they decided that they wanted to have more and a family and have people around them, so they decided to build a city. They argued about where to build the city. Romulus killed Remus and then established the small settlement that was eventually to be called Rome. Tradition tells us that this event occurred in 753 before Common Era or before Christ. The bronze twins were added to the sculpture during the Renaissance period. So originally there was just the she-wolf. Somewhere between 900 and 800 before Christ, the Italian peninsula was settled by the people called Etruscans and Etruria. The Etruscans referred to themselves as Ravenna, but to the Romans and the Greeks they were Etrusii, Tusii, Tyrrhenii, and Tircinii. To the modern Italians, they are still called Etrusii, and the name of the Etruscan sea is still the Tyrrhenian, perhaps for some over 3,000 years. They founded their civilizations in northern eastern Italy, between the Apennine mountain range and the Tyrrhenian Sea. Their civilizations stretched from the Arno River in the north to the Tiber River toward the center of the Italian peninsula. It was on the Tiber River that a small village of Latins, the village that would become Rome, sat. The Romans, who were only villagers during the rise of the Etruscan civilization, were in close contact with the Etruscans, their language, their ideas, their religion, and their civilization. The Etruscans were the single most important influence on Roman culture in its transition to civilization. The Etruscans were indigenous in that the predecessors of the Etruscan civilization, manifesting itself in the regions of Cerveteri, Tarquinia, Volsii, and Vetulonia in the north, and in the early 9th century before Christ, there had been in the region for many hundreds of years beforehand. The Etruscans lived in independent fortified city-states. These city-states would form small confederacies. In the earliest of times, these city-states were ruled by a monarch, but were later ruled by oligarchies that governed themselves through a council and through elected officials. Like the surrounding people, the Etruscans, or Etrusii, as the Italians would call them, were largely an agrarian people, but they had also a strong military and used that military to dominate all the surrounding people. The dominated populations were forced to do the agricultural labor on the Etruscan farms, so the Etruscans would have time to devote to commerce and to industry. In the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, the Etruscan military had subjugated most of Italy, including Rome, and regions outside of Italy, such as the island of Corsica. The Etruscan obsession with elaborate burial leads us to presume that they may have had an underlying belief similar to the Egyptians that a part of the soul remained within the body, or at least that the body was important for the afterlife. The earliest grave sites were cremations, with the ash being retained either in regular urns or urns fashioned to represent huts. Gradually, inhumation burials began to appear, and the first being in Tarquinia and Serre, and during the Orientalizing period eventually became the prevailing rite, except for in northern Etruria, where cremation persisted right up until the 1st century. The famous Etruscan tombs of Cerveteri, modern-day Italian city, which has its foundation on an old Etruscan city of Carrere. These earth and stone outer layers from the outer shell for fantastic rock-cut tombs, which are carved out of the natural tufa stone of the region. The interior of a tomb here shows the bas-reliefs, Bentisci necropolis, and appears to date from about the 7th century before Christ. The tombs of the Etruscans were architecturally constructed to resemble their homes. The tombs of the Serre have no frescoed walls, like its southern neighbor in Tarquinia. The walls are carved with heavy relief depicting many different everyday objects. So there we can see all the different like bas-reliefs or sculptural reliefs like on the wall. The Etruscans also had several deities that we then see moving over into the Roman names. So here we have Apollo or Apollo, Artemis, Diana, Fluns, Bacchus, Minerva and Minerva, Trinia becomes Jupiter, Turan, Venus, Termes, Mercury, and Unai, Juno. So really similar in their pronunciation, some of them, which I think is so interesting. This is a map of Tarkna. This is where a lot of the elaborate funerary rituals took place. Funerary contexts for the Etruscans. Funerary constitute the most abundant archaeological evidence that is found of the Etruscan civilization. The elite members of the Etruscan society participated in elaborate funerary rituals that varied and changed according to both geography and time. The city of Tarquinia, one of the most powerful and prominent Etruscan centers, is known for its painted chambered tombs. The tombs of Triclinium belongs to this group, and its wall paintings reveal important information about not only the Etruscan funeral culture, but also about the society of the living. In advanced Iron Age culture, the Etruscans amassed great wealth based on Italy's natural resources, particularly metal and mineral ores that they exchanged through medium and long-range trade networks. The tomb of Triclinium is the name given to an Etruscan chamber tomb dating back to 470 before Christ, and is located in Monterozzi necropolis of Tarquinia, Italy. Chamber tombs are subterranean rock-cut chambers accessed by an approachway, or dromos, that's the doorway, in many cases. The tombs are intended to contain not only the remains of the deceased, but also various grave goods or offerings deposited along with the deceased. So they would have things just like the Egyptians, they would have them in the afterlife. The tomb of the Triclinium is composed of a single chamber with wall decorations painted in fresco. Discovered in 1830, the tomb takes its name from the three-couch dining room of the ancient Greco-Roman Mediterranean, known as the Triclinium. The earliest painted Etruscan tombs date back to the mid-6th century before Christ and have only painted heraldic figures around doorways or the central wide column supporting two entrances. These are typically representations of sphinxes or mythical monsters, which acted as guardians and show an influence from Phoenicia and the Near East. The 6th century before Christ Campania tomb is a good example. In subsequent centuries, the walls of the tombs of the Etruscan elite were painted more ambitiously, with portions of the tomb divided for specific types of decoration. There was often a large central space with a top cornice or entablature and triangular space reaching the ceiling. In a large central wall space and pediment area, colorful and lively scenes were often painted about mythology, religious practices, ceremonies, and daily Etruscan life, especially banquets. And we see dancing, hunting, fishing, sporting events such as funerary games with competitions of running, jumping, wrestling, boxing, and discus throwing. There is also an occasional scene of couples together. Musicians are another common subject, playing tortoiseshell, lyres, castanets, and double alos flutes. These instruments, the reclining diners on one-armed couches, wine-mixing vessels, and symposium game of throwing wine slops into vase, all show a Greek and particularly Ionian influence. These paintings were directly, again, influenced by Greek painters, but illustrate the local style. Now, this is something we're going to see over and over and over again in art history, where a culture is influenced by another culture, so the style or the imagery might be similar, but then it also incorporates or permeates the culture that adopted it. So we kind of see this happening, and we're going to see that especially when we get into the Middle Ages. Scenes often illustrate funerary celebrations, as we had said, with rites, symbols, and daily events. Roman funerary painting is also inspired by Greeks, but also develops a more domestic and public type of wall painting. Iphigenia is best known as the daughter of Agamemnon, leader of the Greek forces at Troy, and she had to sacrifice in order to appease Artemis. Agamemnon, or perhaps one of the troops in the Greek force of Menelaus, offended Artemis, the virgin. So Artemis sends the contrary wind, which held the Greek fleet in the Bay of Aulis, where it assembled before sailing to Troy. The prophet Calchas divined that the daughter of Agamemnon would have to be sacrificed. So it's interesting that we see, and this would happen in the Black Sea, and an animal would be sent in her place instead of her being sacrificed. So it's interesting to see this come over into some of the Etruscan paintings. The Etruscans were extremely sophisticated with an alphabet based on the Greek alphabet, a powerfully original sculptural and painting tradition, a religion based on human-type gods, which they had learned about from the Greeks, and a complicated set of rituals for divining the future, which they also handed down to the Romans, so the idea of the Oracle of Delphi. Unlike most civilizations of the time, gender inequality seems to have not been very pronounced. While the Etruscans were Busy building their towers over Italy and engaging in active commerce with the East and with Africa, a city to their south began to grow precipitously large, a city imitating Etruscans in many ways, and that city was Rome. Let's take a look at the Etruscan sarcophagus. Sarcophago is the Italian term, and the Greek term, sarcophagus, literally means Greek for flesh eater. This was the name given by the Greeks to a special marble found in Asia Minor near the territory of ancient Troy and used in caskets. It was believed to have properties of destroying the entire body except for the teeth within a few weeks. A handsome couple here recline arm in arm on a ricamera and gently beckon toward the viewer as if inviting one of them to dine with them. They are beautifully modeled, and they have almond eyes and faint smiles, very similar to archaic Greek sculpture. Their hairstyles are detailed. The male figure sports a beard and has his hair parted neatly in the middle. Their faces and hands are given greatest attention by the artist, but oddly, the legs and feet are very rudimentarily modeled. This is another very similar but a different sarcophagi called Deglia Sposi, or sarcophagus of the spouses. It's a masterpiece of Etruscan terracotta work. It was discovered in 1881 at the Bandassesia necropolis in Severtere, broken into more than 400 pieces. Painstakingly reassembled, it is now one of the highlights of the Museo Nazionale Etrusco, or the National Etruscan Museum. Dating back to between 530 and 520 before Christ, the tomb depicts a married couple, half reclining on a banqueted couch. The portrayal of two spouses sharing such a couch is a very uniquely Etruscan design. The man lovingly rests his arm on his wife's shoulders. He is mostly unclothed, apart from a cloak, while his partner is very elegantly attired. She wears a type of hat known as a tutulus, and she sports a pair of pointed sandals. The Sarcophago degli Sposi was discovered by Felice Barnabé, the founder of the Museo Nazionale Etrusco, which is housed in Villa Giuliano. The 16th century villa was originally built by Pope Julius III. This is another brightly painted sarcophagus of the Etruscan period of an aristocratic woman by the name of Ciante. She was discovered in 1886 at Poggio Cantarello near Chiusi in Tuscany, and was subsequently sold, along with its contents, a skeleton and some grave belongings, to a British museum. A similar sarcophagus is in the collection of the National Archaeological Museum in Florence, known as the Sarcophagus of Larthia Cientii. The two women were probably from the same dynastic family of the ancient Chiusii. Moving on to Rome. So if we look at the early map of Rome, we can see here kind of like the northern Italy and where Rome is located. And this map actually shows us how far the Roman Empire moved and expanded. So let's take a look at early Rome. So Rome was founded by an agrarian Italic peoples living south of the Tiber River. They were a tribal people, and the social logic of tribal organization dominated Roman society in both its early and late histories. As the Romans steadily developed their city, its government, and its culture, they imitated the neighbors to the north, the Etruscans. The early Roman government was a monarchy, but it was also founded on a tribal logic. The monarch was given absolute power over the people. The Romans called that power imperium. The monarch's relationship to the people was seen as similar to, or identical to, the power of a father that they had hold over a household. In other words, the Roman monarchy was strictly and only patriarchal. So only men were able to hold office. The relationship between a patriarch and his family is a relationship of a mutual obligation, and this is how the Romans understood the monarchy. In early Roman society, the father exercised incredible authority over the family. The father could even sell his children into slavery, or could kill them if he could justify it. The arbitrary power was limited. Before a father sold or killed his children, he was requested to consult with the family and with the public, and if he was voted down, he wouldn't be able to do it. So the Romans did something that we have not seen prior to this. So if you remember, we talked about the Egyptian sculptures, we talked about the Greek sculptures, how everything was very sort of simplified, and this idea of strength of body, mind, and spirit, and how even though some of the sculptures were found with some pieces missing, we never saw just a bust, just the head of a sculpture. And we certainly didn't go so realistic to have an actual, facial mirror of the person. And so what we see here is Roman sculpture really changing the idea of sculpture. They start to look at the human being as a almost as if they were trying to do a replica. So Roman sculpture is very observational, trying to capture the essence of the subject. It's based in the tradition of making busts from death masks or from the Etruscan funerary sculpture masks. The portraits are painfully accurate, describing almost a super realism. Busts such as this would have always been kept in the home in a special alcove called the tablinum. Just as the Etruscan tombs, the contemporary generation would always be in close touch with those of their ancestors. Another reason why that this mattered so much to the Romans is because the Romans believed in familia, in family, and they, you could look up at that bust and you could say, look at me, look at my father. I am my father's son, so I am a Roman citizen. So that was an important distinction, that you were a Roman citizen. The Roman family was called familia, which is the Latin term for family. Familia could include the triad with which we are familiar, 2 parents and a child, biological or adopted, as well as enslaved people and grandparents. The head of the family, referred to as the pater familia, was in charge of even the adult males in the familia. While the father was not allowed to kill or sell his wife, like he could his children, he was allowed to divorce her. This was allowed, however, only in the most extreme of circumstances. In addition, the father, or the pater, served as the priest of the family. The English definition of the word family consists of husband, wife, and children. That does not correspond to the meanings of the Latin familia. Husband, wife, and children did not constitute an independent family among the Romans, and were not always members even of the same family. The Roman familia, in its sense, nearest to that of the English word family, was made up of those persons who were subject to the authority of the head of the house, or the pater familia. So like we said just a minute ago, it could be slaves, it could be adopted, it could be if you had a son and that son had a wife and they had children, they would still be subject to the head of the household. The eldest male father or pater. These persons might make a host of themselves, like the wife with unmarried daughters, or sons and adopted sons, married or unmarried with their wives, sons, unmarried daughters, and even remote descendants, always through the male though. Yet they made up one family, or familia, in the eyes of the Romans. The head of such a familia, or head of the household, the nearest word would be sui, or master, independent master. With others, there were alio in subjecti, subject to another's authority. In many ways, the Roman monarch followed the model of power, absolute but limited by the people, their welfare, and the traditions. The monarch served as a legislature, as the head of the military, as the head of the judiciary, and as the chief priest to the people. His authority, however, was limited and controlled by the constitution, which he was powerless to change. So, in Roman marriage, polygamy was never sanctioned, and for 5 centuries after the founding of the city, divorce was entirely unknown. Up until the 6th century before Christ, patricians were the only citizens and intermarried only with patricians and with members of surrounding communities having social standing. So there was a caste-like system. The only form of marriage had to have consent from the gods. The patrician took his wife from his father's family into his own to be a mater familia, or mother of the family, to bear him children who could conserve the family mystery and perpetuate the ancient race and extend the power of Rome. So Rome went from a small village into a monarchy. The Roman kingdom, also referred to as Roman monarchy, or the regal period of ancient Rome, was the earliest period of Roman history when the city and its territories were ruled by kings. I believe there were 7 kings in all. According to the tradition, the Roman kingdom began with the city, founding in 753 before Christ, with settlements around the Palatine Hills, along the river Tiber in central Italy, and ended with the overthrow of the kings and the establishment of a republic in 509 before Christ. Little is known for certain about the kingdom's history, as no records and few inscriptions from the times of the kings survive. The accounts of this period, written during the Republic and in the Empire, are largely based on the oral tradition of the pagans. And the pagan in Roman literally means rustic. So it was the rustic people, or the old people, the ancients, that passed down the story. The site of the founding Roman kingdom and eventually Republican Empire included a fjord where one could cross the river Tiber in central Italy. The Palatine Hills and the hills surrounding it provided easily defensible positions in the wide fertile plain surrounding them. Each of these features contribute to the success. The traditional version of Roman history, which has come down principally through Livy, 64 to 59 before Christ, and Plutarch, 46 to 120, and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, 60 to 7 BC, recounts that a series of 7 kings ruled the settlement in Rome's first centuries. The traditional chronology, as codified by Varro and Fabius Pictor, allow 243 years for their combined reigns, and average about 35 years each. Since the work of Barthold Niebuhr, a modern scholarship, has generally discounted this schema, the Gauls destroyed many of the Rome's historical records when they sacked the city after the Battle of Aelia in 390 before Christ. According to Polybius, the battle occurred in 387 to 386 before Christ, and what remained eventually fell prey to time or to theft. With no contemporary records of the kingdom surviving, all accounts of the Roman kings must truly be questioned. The elders were originally clan leaders, and this function probably didn't change too much, so the Senate in its earliest form was a kind of a clan confederacy. The Senate had a power to approve or veto the appointment of the king, so no individual could ascend the throne without the approval of the clan leaders. This is another image of a patrician with a bust. And so the patricians were landowners and members of the upper Roman class, and they would be the ones that could be, voted into Senate. And here we can see that the patrician is holding 2 more busts, which were most likely his relatives, maybe father, grandfather. Full figures such as this illustrate the Roman reverence for age and for wisdom and the citizenship, the idea that you were a citizen. A statue of this Roman holding the busts of his ancestors is one of the main examples of Roman portrait sculpture mastery of the ancient period. It was created during the reign of the Emperor Octavian Augustus, but its form is not uniform because it shows the stylistic changes of Roman portraiture of the second half of the 1st century. The entire sculpture was created during the reign of Emperor Augustus, as evidenced by the way of the patrician's toga and the way it's draped. The portrait held in the right hand comes from 50 to 40 before Christ, and the one on the left hand dates 20 to 15 years before Christ. The standing figure itself, although it was created in antiquity, has acquired its present form in modern times. The work is described as a testimony to the realism of ancient Roman portraiture, which combines the version of Roman bourgeoisie art with idealizing approach typical of a Greek psychological portraiture. Moreover, it refers to the tradition of death masks. The first stylistic tendency, that is verism, is visible especially in the face of the standing man, who objectively reflects the appearance and individual features of the model, taking into account his separate inner life without any tendency to beautify. The idealization characteristics of Greek art is present in the portraits of the ancestors, which are characterized by a more subtle modeling, nobility, and seriousness of feature, and represent the masculine and austere ideal of a traditional male virtue. This idealization also results from the custom of paying tribute to the dead and the worship of one's ancestors. The form and meaning of these statues are related to the tradition of death masks and images maiorum, which were probably used to create portraits of the ancestors held in the hands of this Roman statue. These death masks were to enable the memory of a deceased member of a Roman familia to be preserved as long as possible. They were originally made of wax with great accuracy, recreating the feature of the deceased, and they were worn by participants in aristocratic funerals as early as the 2nd century before Christ. They were kept in wardrobes on a daily basis and were solemnly displayed in the atrium during holidays. Various materials were used to create them: terracotta, wood, but most of all, wax, which became the most popular since around 300 before Christ, when Lysistrata discovered the technique of casting a face with the wax material. Over time, masks began to be copied in stone to better preserve the features and the revered ancestors, because obviously the wax would start to deteriorate. The creator of this work is anonymous. We don't know, like most artists in antiquity, but it is believed, however, that the authors of the most outstanding portraits of the era of Emperor Augustus and this statue belonged to Latinized Greeks. So they were Greeks that came over to Rome. The differences in the way of facial formation visible in the sculpture testify to the influence of various schools of Hellenistic art. The sculpture portrays the patrician and his ancestors from the Barberini family in the era of the New Republic during the reign of Emperor Augustus. Patricians had a privileged social class that had the exclusive right to hold important offices and came from distinguished old families. They too had the privilege of removing their masks and creating an ancestral gallery, and consequently the right to honor them in a stone sculpture. So only chosen ones could afford this kind of a portrait, like this statue of Barberini. This is not the only reason why this work is so valuable. Its value is also evidenced by the professionalism of its execution and the synthetic depiction of the development of the styles of ancient Roman portraiture. Currently, you can see this sculpture in the Capitoline Museum in Rome. The Assembly of Rome consisted of all male citizens. Citizenship was granted only to individuals who could demonstrate that both parents were native Romans. Hence, this extremely important masks, sculptures of busts of their family members. The Assembly's principal function was to grant imperium to the monarch, ratified by the Senate. There was, therefore, a limited democracy in the Roman kingdom. The clan leaders approved the candidate for the king, and the entire male population of Rome handed the king absolute power. The assembly was organized into 30 groups based on kinship lines. Each group got one single vote. So there were a grand total of 30 votes in the assembly. Each group would base its vote on the majority decision of the group. So while the citizens had a certain amount of say in the government, in the assembly, that influence was greatly diminished by a diffusion in the group vote. As Rome grew in power and influence, wealth began to accumulate in the hands of a very few people. Society was divided into two groups, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the wealthy people. They controlled trade, power, and military, and only patricians could serve as leaders, and only patricians were allowed to sit on the Senate or hold any appointed or elected offices. The plebeians, on the other hand, were everybody else, the majority of the population. They were the farmers, the hard laborers, the craft people, the cleaning people. They worked for the patricians. Some small farmers worked their own lands rather than the lands of the wealthy. The plebeians had a very small voice in government. The assembly was the governmental body that represented the interests, although the institution of the group vote severely watered down any individual voices. And here we can kind of see the trade routes, and as they moved in, and the different kinds of things that they traded in. And so this was all controlled, all of it was controlled by the patricians. The following deities were those that Rome inherited or borrowed from the Greeks. And as we know, that also they, brought those gods in from the Etruscans as well. So here we have a listing of the different gods in the Roman Empire. I'd like to move on and take a look at some of the sculpture or the architecture. This is the Temple of Portunus. This is a small temple of Portunus named after the deity of the port. It is located in the Forum of Borarium, where the first bridges were built. It was restored in the 1st century before Christ, and is so well preserved because the temple was converted to use as a church late in the 9th century. This view from shows the engaged columns, and the temple is also commonly but mistakenly called the Temple of Fortuna Virilis. But what do we notice here? We notice kind of an interesting column, very similar to the Greek sculptures, the early Greeks, the Greek architecture. So if we look at the bottom, we've got the rings, and then if we come up to the top, we can see the volutes, and then the pediment. Very simple. But let's take a look at the overhead. So there we can see those columns in the front that are freestanding, and then the porch or pronaos, the stairway to the front. So it's not all the way around necessarily the way that we would see some of the Greek buildings or temples. And then on the sides, because it was colder in Italy, we see a wall. And the wall has engaged columns, or columns that are sort of built into the wall. And inside of the walled area, they call that the cella, and then the podium is what it all stands on. So let's take a look here. So there we can see some of the engaged columns, like literally built into the brick. And that's the back view. And they are like similar to Ionic columns around the cella. So the Romans loved the architecture and sculpture of the Greeks, and they adopted it wholeheartedly, and many times had Greek artists that would come and help them build these things. So we see a lot of the borrowing of that Greek aesthetic, but then changing it for a Roman culture, right? Let's take a look at Pompeii. So on August 23rd, 79 after Christ, or AD, Pompeii looked like any other busy, prosperous city. People were moving about, they were trading their goods, news, talking, friendly talk in the market, and so on. And then 3 days later, on August 26th, all of these sounds fell silent, and the place itself vanished. Almost nothing was seen of Pompeii for more than 1,500 years. Now, more than 1,900 years later, we have learned more about the last days of Pompeii and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which destroyed life in Pompeii, and also did something incredibly important. It preserved a treasury of information about what life was like in the ancient Roman Empire. When they discovered the city of Pompeii, one of the things they did was they knew that there were so many people that had died. They started to pour plaster and concrete into the holes where the people would have been, and they started to see all of these bodies. Since 1758, when the excavation began in Pompeii, palaces of the Caesars and private homes of the nouveau riche merchants and court hangers-on have emerged, along with theaters, dance halls, circuses. In addition, there were grand-style temples, amphitheaters were uncovered, along with elaborate public baths and for hundreds and hundreds of people, and a water supply system that would run both hot and cold water for both private and public needs. This is the House of Pansa in Pompeii, and if we look here, we can see how the house is divided up. So within the house, there's a vegetable garden, a kitchen, a baker's shop, a bakehouse, a big oven, an improvarium, separate houses, atriums, porticos, a wooden shed, a gardener's shed, a winter dining room, and so on. Here we can see the interior of the House of Pansa and how the walls were painted with fresco and just very ornately painted. This is the atrium of this, it's called the House of the Silver Wedding in Pompeii. This house derived its name from the time it was excavated in 1893, which coincided with silver wedding celebrations for the sovereigns of Italy. This beautiful house gives the impression of a dignified grandeur on entering. There is an entrance hall with enormous Corinthian columns and 2 baths, one side inside and one other in the garden. So in order to make all of this happen, we cannot exclude the use of concrete. I mean, the Roman Empire wouldn't have existed without concrete. So the use of concrete allowed the Romans to enclose large spaces for their baths and their other rectangular structures called basilicas as the empire grew. It required extensive new public construction. When the old Roman Forum could no longer cope with the commercial and political demands of the growing city, for example, Augustus constructed the adjoining Forum of Augustus and decorated it with sculpture and inscriptions honoring the great Romans of the past. Architects used Greek columns but adapted them to enhance a distinctly Roman architectural setting. Emperors from Augustus to Constantine built new forums or added basilicas to existing forums to provide space for the public and private businesses of a growing empire. During his reign, Trajan, from 98 to 117 after Christ, constructed vast markets for distributing food. The vault hall in the Forum of Trajan continues today as a site for special exhibitions. So let's take a look at how the Romans used concrete to make all of these buildings. So there were 3 forms, the way that they dealt with concrete: opus incertum, opus reticulatum, and opus testaceum. The Romans made concrete by mixing 1 part sand with 1 part chalk and adding water. Now, what is interesting to me, and this is something I think about all the time, is I drive down a road in our city, and sure, we have winter, but why does the concrete crack in 2 years? Where this stuff has been around for over 2,000 years, and it's still there. It is still there, still solid. There's aqueducts that the Romans built that are still used as aqueducts today, are still used as roads today. It's incredible. So this is opus incertum wall with concrete and rubble core. Pompeii, opus testaceum, a brick wall made with rubble and a concrete core. So there you can kind of see what that would look like in real life. This is a composite wall with a pumice top and rubble in the middle. And so then what they would do is face that wall so that all the stuff that you saw was not made out of bricks, hard bricks, and fit it all together, or like stones that were cut for columns. They were literally made of concrete and molded to look a particular way. So there we have an opus incertum wall covered with stucco. This is a brick wall covered by layers of stucco revetment, and it's in the forum. And there you can see, like inside the way the bricks are laid back and forth for strength. This is a wall of a passageway in the Colosseum, set in oblique angles to hold the stucco together. So really, really masterful use of concrete. And then these are heating ducts. So they would make them out of clay. They were called hypokos, and they embedded them in the wall of a house. And so the water would be heated, and then it would send steam up, and the walls would stay warm. Okay, so let's go to the next really important invention of the Romans, and that is the arch. So the way that the arch works is if you take stone or brick, concrete brick, and you create two walls. Remember, we had post and lintel, and we did not have arches until now. And so what they did was they took a keystone and then two side stones that were angled. This was called the voussoirs. And like if we look at those arrows, the way that they're pointing, it shows that the keystone basically holds the weight and pushes it all down into the ground, or into the jamb, or the piers, if you will, to be able to make the whole thing work. And then across the top is the spandrel. So that would be the piece that would go over the top, enclosing the arch, right? And so that way we were able to have larger openings, and you'll see why in just a second. So this would be our typical round arch with the use of a keystone and voussoir stones and a jamb. The jamb would be that those big pieces on the side. So then what they did was they took one arch and put it onto another and onto another and onto another, and they created a vault, or an opening, right? So they call this one the barrel vault, and notice that the side walls are very thick because that supports the weight of the round top, right? So they call the side walls a buttress. So it butts up against the arch, the succession of arches, and holds the whole thing together. And after they did that, they discovered that they could make an even bigger space if they took one barrel vault and crisscrossed it with another. And they call this the groin vault. So here we have one vault going one way and another vault going another way. So this included a bay. It made like a large area. And this is primarily how the Colosseum was built. So there we have piers, which are like big, heavy columns, but they're all, laid stone interlockingly to be able to support the weight of those arched vaults at the top. So to look at the whole vaulting system in general, this is what we see. So we start off with the arch, we move to the barrel vault, and then we crisscross them to the groin vault. This becomes the architectural technique that we use for the next 1,000 years. We use this all the way through until we get to the Gothic cathedrals. So here we can see the use. So this is called the barrel vault. This is a Basilica of Maxentius. We're going to look at that again in a second. And Constantine's Roman Forum. And also what we see in the roof, if you look at the roof inside of the barrel vault, right? See how there's like a honeycomb kind of cutout? Those are called coffered cutouts. So those were, they were worried about the strength. So the edge of the stone that the brick that they created was thick, but the inside was kind of cut out so it would be thinner. So where it would meet the next one would be very strong, but then it had this coffered look. Now, if you go around the city and you go, say, for example, to the courthouse in Milwaukee, and you look up, you will see a coffered ceiling. Another place is the aqueducts. So this is the Pont du Gard. This bridge is over the River Gard, is 900 feet long and 160 feet high. It was part of an aqueduct nearly 30 miles long, which supplied Nimes in France with water. On its first level, it carries a road, and at the top of the third level is a water conduit, which is 6 feet high and 4 feet wide and has a gradient of 0.4%. The 3 levels were built in distressed stone without mortar, and it is still being used today, and you can still run water through it. So that's really pretty incredible. But without this kind of building techniques, the Roman Empire wouldn't exist, because they wouldn't have been able to bring their vast armies over to the other areas that they conquered. So let's take a look at Augustus of Prima Porta. Octavian became Augustus Caesar in 27 before Christ with an elaborate public show of resignation and humility. Augustus was a religious title meaning revered, which the Roman people bestowed upon Octavian in honor of his service. This is the chest piece that we see in the last sculpture. So let's go back a second. You can see it there. And so here's a detail. The central group depicts a Parthian giving back the lost eagle from Carrhae to a Roman general. If historically correct, this latter would be Tiberius, but a symbolic reading permits him to be Romulus, with the wolf at his feet. Aeneas, Mars, or some other important figure, apart from some female-seated figures representing conquered peoples such as the Gauls and the Hispanians, the rest form a cosmic setting. The sky god, Calus, Sol in his chariot, Aurora, Apollo on a winged griffin, Diana on a stag, all flying around above Tellus, who is cradling 2 babies. The Re Gestia were his memoirs, recording all his victories in Gaul and Spain. Military victories in the provinces which brought the Pax Romana, or the peace to the Roman people. So Octavian was lionized by the Roman people. He promoted conservative republican values, even though he failed to reestablish it. He tried to restore faith in the Roman state by equating his role as Pontifex Maximus with religious and moral values. Augustus used religion to reorganize the state and to establish his own rule. He assumed the title of Pontifex Maximus, or head priest, and revived old religious traditions like Lupercalia festival to further associate the emperor with the state cult. He promoted the cult of the emperor as divine by building a temple to the divine Julius. His views on morality extended to laws regarding adultery, unchastity, and bribery. Under Augustus, widowers were required to remarry within 3 years of losing a spouse, and those fathering large families were rewarded with public recognition. Augustus stands in a contrapposto pose that echoes the one of classical Greek athletes such as Doryphorus or Polykleitos. The Cupid on the dolphin on his feet hints at the origins of gens Julia. So this is in the 9th century before Christ. This altar was built to commemorate this great peace after the Gallic and Hispanic campaigns and wars were won by Octavian. The ara consists of a rectangular enclosure inside of which is an actual altar, and then the scenes around. So this is the most significant scene in the restored bas-relief is the one depicting Augustus, Agrippa, Julius, and Tiberius. Along the base of the wall that runs along the Via Ripetta is a bronze reproduction of Augustus' testimonial plaque called by historians the Re Gestae. And there we can see a little bit of how they thought that the reproduction, what it would look like. And so you can see there's areas that have fallen apart, but the way that the stones fell, that's, the way that they drew in what probably was there. Now, is it completely accurate? Maybe, maybe not. This is the Gemma Augustea. This is a cameo depicting the apotheosis of Augustus. He is seated next to the goddess Roma, and both are trampling the armor of defeated enemies. It is one of the most impressive carved cameos of a series of Roman gems representing imperial persons. The Gemma Augusta, now in a museum in Vienna, was probably carved during the reign of Caligula, about between 37 and 41 after Christ. Let's take a look at the Colosseum. So the Colosseum took 10 years to build. It was the largest structure of its type. It stood 160 feet high with 4 stories of windows, arches, and columns. Each of the 3 exterior floors consisted of 80 arches. As many as 50,000 spectators with numbered tickets entered through 76 of the entrances on the ground level. The facade, now remember, it's concrete, right? So they put a facade of limestone, brick, and concrete with marble facing. 3 orders superimposed the outside. So there was the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Now that's something you probably never would have seen in Greece on the outside. Now maybe you would have different orders on the inside, but definitely not on the outside. There's barrel vaults that radiate from the elliptical center, weight carried on travertine piers and vaults. The weight was carried that way. Marbles only on the lower tiers, because the upper tiers would be for the plebeians, right? So the patricians would only be in the lower areas where the marble was. There was fabric. There was like sticks on the top where there's evidence of they had a canopy, and so they would put fabric over the top of the entire thing that would cover them from the sun. 2 of the remaining entrances were used by Emperor Titus, and 2 for the gladiators. Upon entering the Colosseum, visitors climbed sloping ramps to their seats, according to gender and, of course, social class. Here's an interior view of what it might have looked like. And right now, I believe in 2021, they started actually building a floor. The lower levels is where all of the animals and gladiators and slaves and whoever else was going to be fighting, that's where they all were kept. Women and the poor stood at or sat on wooden benches in the 4th tier. Depending on the weather, an enormous colored awning, or what was known as, again, the velarium, would be stretched overhead to prevent from the hot sun. A wood flooring was used to cover the subterranean chambers where the gladiators as well as the animals were kept for their performances. Here's a photograph. During the last 10 years of his existence, the stadium was filled with water and used for mock naval battles. However, over time, the Romans found it was damaging the foundation as well as the flooring. So, persecutions. In the 200 plus years, there are 200s, like the B200 AD, there had been terrible persecutions. And since there were no complete records, we do not know exactly how many Christians met their deaths. Certainly there were hundreds, if not thousands, and some have claimed millions. Many more poor people whose names we don't even know were killed. Besides torture and death, their property was taken away from them. Many Christians had no security because disgruntled neighbors often would turn them in as Christians to get their property and defame them. The persecution, both east and west, was revived and intensified under Diocletian and under Licinius. It would not be long, however, before persecution began to subside in the west, but not in the east. This is the Arch of Titus. It's located at the highest point of the Via Sacra, which leads to the Roman Forum. It is a triumphal arch that commemorates the victory of the Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus in the conquest of Judea. Engaged fluted columns frame the passageway. The spandrels depict victories in relief of the conquest of Judea. The attic contains an inscription, and the internal faces of the passageway depict triumphal processions. The arch was erected posthumously after Titus had already become a divus, or a god. Senators Romanus, Divo, Tito, Divo, Vespasiani, and Augusto, and the people of Rome, helped to erect the arch. So here's a detail. We see soldiers walking left to right. They're carrying spoils of war, which include 7 armed candelabrum, or the menorah, and the silver trumpets from the Temple of Jerusalem. The signs carried by some soldiers displayed the names of the conquered cities and the people. To the right, the procession is entering the city through the Porta Triumphalis. The owner of this beautiful house was the priest of Mars and a decurion of the city. There is no trace of an impluvium in the atrium, and to the right of the area is a lalarium. Behind the tablinum, there is a small, pretty garden where, in the small niche of the fountain, there are marble statues of Hermes, satyrs, cupids, and dolphins. In the rooms to the side of the atrium, there are many small pictures showing mythological creatures, gods, cupids, and to the right of the tablinum, there is a large picture showing the triumph of Bacchus. The god is holding a weapon, and he is followed by a satyr of victory. Here's an image from the house of Lucretius. So there we can see the bath in the center. Here's the south wall of Lucretius, and there we can see the many small pictures and so forth in fresco. Here's a landscape that was discovered in fresco. And there we can see that trompe l'oeil, meaning that it looks like architectural elements, but it's really just painted in. Another painting of the marriage of Bacchus and Ariadne. These are garden frescoes. They were found in the Villa of Livia, and they are beautiful, green, luscious works of Roman painting. They are in the National Museum, and they were brought there in 1955. In the foreground, we see a low wicker with kind of fence running around the whole room. Behind comes a grassy walkway, bordered on the far side by a stone parapet. The stone enclosure have recesses and some for single trees. And the background consists of a variety of vegetation, where the laurel is omnipresent in different shapes. So the laurel, or sweet laurel, is what we call a bay leaf today. In the midst of the leaves, nightingales, orioles, magpies, swallows, blackbirds, and many other species of birds can be identified. According to ancient sources, Augustus owned a talking magpie, as well as a raven and a parrot. There were many cults also in Rome, like cults of different gods and goddesses, and this is an image showing sort of a ritual for the cult of Bacchus. Bacchus is basically the Roman Dionysus. There are some differences in character and representation, but Bacchus is usually portrayed as young and beardless, and his rites are about joy, drinking affairs, basically drunken affairs. But they are essentially the same god. The Roman celebration of Bacchus were called Bacchanalia, a term that has come to be used more recent to describe a kind of wild party. His cult had rituals where they drank wine as well as communal meals of a bull, elaborate ceremonies and rules, and believed in breaking free from societal norms. Dionysus promised new life to his followers, and the initiation ceremony involved a ritual death and rebirth, sort of like baptism. Perhaps for this reason they called him Lysios, Redeemer. His cult was not always seen as acceptable, however, particularly in Rome, as the rites often resulted in sort of prophecies, and so they were restrained in 186 after Christ. Later, the membership rose to the cult to around 500. Dionysian initiates were still active in around 500 Common Era or after Christ, when Nonnus wrote a poem in honor of him. Dionysius festivals were held in March, December, and January 6th. The Roman forums. So what is a forum? A forum is a Latin term for the marketplace. It was administrative and corporate heart of Rome. Generally, this word referred to the open space in any Roman town where people could conduct business, judicial, civic, or religious activities were conducted. A typical forum might be surrounded by temples, shops, and basilicas, large covered structures used for meetings. In Rome, there were several different forums. The most famous Roman was the Roman Forum, and it was designed by the architect Vitruvius, who felt that the proportions needed to be 3 by 2, 3 length, 2 wide. So there we can see an image of what a Roman forum might look like. The first imperial forum was built by Caesar in 54 before Christ. Most subsequent emperors built their own forums. They included Nerva, Vespasian, and Trajan, who built the largest, which covered an area of 25 acres. Hello. For centuries, the Roman Forum was the site of the city's most important public meetings. The reliefs on the Triple Arch represented many of Rome's victories. That was the Arch of Septimus. And they were decorated with prows of warships and captured battles, during battle and so on. The Roman Forum became a spectacular showcase of the empire, filled with beautiful statues and architecture. Eventually, the Roman Forum proved too small for Rome's ever-growing public activities. So here we see an overhead of Trajan's Forum, and there we have an equestrian statue of Trajan, the Basilica Uppia, and then the Trajan Column. The Trajan Forum had 150 shops and offices, so it was like a great big mall, basically a shopping mall. Flowers, fish, vegetables, fruit, cloth, silk from all over the world. The upper level was most likely used for selling wines and oils because archaeologists found storage jugs there that had residue from those wine and oil types. Marcus Ulpius Traianus was born in Italica in what is now Spain. His family had settled there long before, but his father was the first to endeavor in a senatorial career. Trajan had distinguished military career and was stationed in various parts of the empire. He was adopted by the Emperor Nerva, and that is how he took over the throne. Otherwise, he wasn't, born a Roman. He conquered Dacia and most of Parthia. The Column of Trajan is not the only one of its kind, but it was definitely the first. And there we can see the column, and there we can see all the different wars that, were commemorated that he won. It was built in 113 after Christ. It stood 97 feet tall, and it has a frieze that wrapped around it that, if stretched out, would be about 650 feet long. It covers 18 drums of the column and has over 2,500 figures, highly detailed. The frieze was 3 feet tall and showed many of the different scenes, everything from war to images of the gods. And this is an interior. So at the bottom of the column, the river god of the Danube watches the armies build a bridge over his river. There was also a band where the soldiers are building a fortress with Emperor Trajan looking on. On one band, there is a picture of Dacians attacking the fortress. In the band, the fighting method is called the turtle, or testudo, where all the soldiers take their long shields and put themselves under it to make one big shield when the arrows come. And we see this a lot in movies where, that's how we know about these things, because there were so many documentation from ancient Rome. On the column, there are windows letting in light into the interior staircase that winds all the way up the whole column. It is not open to the public. When Trajan died in 117 after Christ, he and his wife Plotina's ashes were put in gold containers and placed in the base of the column. The architect of the column was Apollodorus of Damascus. And here's a digital recreation of what the Trajan's Forum might have looked like. Here's another, just to give you an idea. There we see the coffered ceilings and so on. It's pretty great. Okay, so next we're going to look at the Pantheon. So the Pantheon is one of the most impressive buildings in Rome. It was rebuilt in 117 after Christ by the Emperor Hadrian to replace an earlier temple that was designed by Agrippa in 27 before Christ. The original rectangular temple consisted of 16 singular granite columns, and that became the porch for the newly devised dome. So this was why this is so important. It was a dome. So how did they make this dome? Well, it was the idea of the way they made those barrel vaults and the arch stones, and they kind of conceived a way to, displace the weight of the ceiling. So you didn't have huge open spaces. Everything always had either piers from the groin vaults, or they had columns like they did in the hypostyle columns of Karnak. There was always something. But if we look at the model over to the right here, we can see that there's an incredibly large open space. So once the Romans learned how to use concrete, they were able to mold anything from the ground up. And they made rounded tops for their buildings, and they hoist them up and to place on top of what they called the rotunda. So here, again, let's take a look at that space a little closer. We can see there's the old temple from Agrippa, which becomes the porch of the Pantheon. Inside, we have the coffered ceiling. Remember, we talked about being able to cut away the stone. So, the concrete, so that when we put the stones together, it would be strong in the middle, but not, And so the thing that's really interesting about this is that if we measure, some of these concrete walls down at the base are 21 feet thick. They're like ridiculous. That was to be able to hold all this weight. Notice the coffered ceiling, and then at the top we have the oculus, which was a big hole. They really were afraid that if they put a stone in the top, that the whole thing would collapse. So that's where they always have these holes. And we're going to see that recreated in architecture by paintings throughout the next 2,000 years. And then we have these little inlets where maybe the god or goddess would have been, and this big drum where that 21-foot thick concrete is around the base to hold the whole thing up. The Pantheon is just such a structure with an opening at the center for the top of the dome. Because this opening is not covered, the floor is slightly concave with a drain at the center so it can catch rainwater when necessary. And so that hole at the top, we call that the oculus. So Hadrian became Roman Empire in 117 after the death of Trajan. He was born either in Spain or in Rome, and as a child, who was a cousin of Hadrian's late father, Trajan became his guardian. Later, Hadrian's ties to Trajan were reinforced by the marriage to Sabina, a niece of Trajan, and later became the formal adoption. So Hadrian's villa is a large Roman villa built by the emperor in the early 2nd century after Christ. The villa was sumptuous and complex with over 30 buildings covering the area of about 250 acres, or about the size of Concordia's campus, maybe even 300, which much of it is still unexcavated. There's also Hadrian's Wall, all that goes all the way across Britain. So let's talk about Maxentius. Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maxentius wasn't appointed Caesar when Diocletian, his father, reigned in 305, but he acclaimed himself as emperor and forced Maximinus to support him to gain legitimacy for his bid for the throne. Constantine, by 312, the only remaining contender for the throne of the West, confronted Maxentius at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, just north of Rome, where Maxentius was killed, and Constantine became the sole emperor of the West. But let's take a look at some of Maxentius, this particular building. So this building is called a basilica. And why? Because this was a place where they could have many, many, many people gather. And the way that the building was created was, remember we said whatever the dimension would be, 3 times long as it was 2 times wide. And we see that it's built with these columns on the interior and these arches that hold up the ceiling. So let's take a better look here. So the Basilica of Maxentius, also called the Basilica of Constantine, was built in the 4th century. It was the last structure built in the city, which shows the magnificence of ancient Rome. The basilica was used as a place for Rome's public law courts. It is an enormous structure that was begun by Maxentius and was completed by Constantine. Part of the structure, which faces the Forum, has been restored. This structure inspired the plans of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. The word basilica is defined in the dictionary as an oblong building ending in a semicircular apse, which is that little round area at the end of the building, and used in ancient Rome, especially for courts of justice and places of public assembly. And there we can see our coffered ceilings. The Basilica of Constantine housed the offices of the prefect of the city, the highest-ranking imperial officer during the reign of Constantine the Great. And the colossal statue was stood in the apse of the basilica. Constantine appeared seated in a globe, with a globe in one hand and the other hand raised in salute. The statue was extremely large. Today, only the head and the lower arms and the hands and the feet were made of marble. The rest of the statue was covered in clothing and and like I said, was most likely wooden, covered with bronze or plaster. It seems that the statue wore a crown or some other headgear, but nothing remains. The pieces of the statue were found in 1486 in the west apse of the basilica, where it stood in antiquity. They have been in the courtyard of the Palazzo di Conservatori ever since. The Edict of Milan is extremely important, and it was the proclamation initiated by Constantine, but agreed to by Licinius, by which Christianity was now given legal status and equal to paganism, if not superior to it. Persecution in any form from 313 was supposed to come to a stop. The edict decreed that Christians were no longer to be persecuted, that is, not brought before judges and not tortured or killed because they were Christian. The document went further than that, though. If their land or houses had been taken away, they were to be given back, without the necessity of going to court to try to get their property. If new owners objected, they were to receive compensation from the government. Now, there's always been some dispute as to whether or not Constantine was a Christian. We don't know for sure. We know that he had a dream about Christ and decided to legalize Christianity at this time, but we don't know that he was actually a Christian or he just made it appropriate for Christians to be worship in public and to not be persecuted. And that ends the journey of the ancient Iron Age peoples to Etruscans, to ancient Rome, and to eventually the Empire of Rome.